presentations and talks this semester with the Graduate Field Committee in Middle East Studies. We welcome Daanish Faruqi, who comes to us today from Georgetown, I believe.
Immediately from Georgetown, yes.
From Georgetown, where he was presenting his new book that he will also present to us today. Daanish is a doctoral candidate in history at Duke University and currently a visiting scholar at the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University. Broadly speaking, his interest is in Islamic political thought, with a specific interest in Sufism and revolution. He's also a former Fulbright scholar. He has spent several years in the Arab Middle East as a researcher and a journalist. So he has worked for Al Jazeera, for Common Dreams, for USC Annenberg, Religion Dispatches, and other media outlets. And today he's going to present his new book, co-edited book, under the title, edited under the title Egypt and the Contradictions of Liberalism, which appeared
earlier this year.
With
one
world press. You can find the information here. All right. Please help me welcome. Looking forward to the talk.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wen. I'd like to thank UMD, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, just for arranging this discussion. A special thanks to my beloved mentor and advisor, Dr. Ahmed Mustafa, who, despite having trained under him years ago, I still to this day refer to him as Sheikh al-Awwal, which significates being that's what Muslim philosophers used to refer to Aristotle. So this is, it's always a pleasure to be in his presence.
It's okay, it's nice. I'm almost right, Aristotle, I think.
So I'll begin this discussion with the apology that I am decidedly low-tech. I tend not to use PowerPoint. I'm a bit of a Luddite. I'm of the belief if what I have to say isn't engaging enough, sufficiently engaging to get your attention, then quite frankly, I don't deserve your attention. No technological crutch is going to stand to change that, so for better or worse. So I thought what I would do today is talk a bit first about my own motivations for pursuing this project, with the caveat that this is a little bit difficult to do when dealing with a decidedly collaborative endeavor. So in that sense, I'm going to be speaking on no one's behalf but my own. And then from there, I'll thrust into some of the historical and philosophical interventions uncovered therein. I'll do my best to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll go into the Q&A. That's really the fun part. My goal is not some stale lecture, but it's an interactive a discussion as possible. And so from there, I begin. First, what motivated this project? By way of preface, my scholarly work in recent years decidedly has not been centered on Egypt as such. I mean, owing perhaps the fact that I now speak Arabic with a thick Moroccan accent makes very clear that my interests and active engagements in the region have largely gone westward. My primary work is mostly in the Maghreb region. I also do some work in the Levant, Syria, but Egypt has not really been on my radar over the past several years. That said, on a personal level, all roads ultimately lead back to Cairo. That's where I began my career. Before becoming an academic in the strictest sense of the term, I found myself in Egypt shortly after graduating college, unable to speak a word of Arabic at the time, taking on a role as a human rights researcher at a prominent Egyptian think tank, which later gave rise to moonlighting as a journalist. And during that period, I worked very intimately with the mainstays of oppositional politics in Egypt, to the point that I was personally very well acquainted with major Egyptian leftist and liberal activists and intellectuals. Many were my mentors, and in turn I wound up defending several of them in writing and my role as a journalist. Figures under consideration were scions of liberal activism under the Mubarak years, and many had spent considerable time in Mubarak's prisons in support of progressive reform. Thus, it was hardly surprising that many of my old mentors among the Egyptian liberals became deeply involved in some capacity in the uprising that in 2011 toppled the regime of longtime Egyptian autocrat Hosni Mubarak, an event which we had all hoped portended a new dawn for Egypt, and hopefully for the rest of the Arab world. But it came as a remarkable surprise that many of those same old mentors and associates among the Egyptian liberal intelligentsia and activist community took active part in what transpired next. Briefly, following a period of stewardship by the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, SCAF, the Muslim Brotherhood-affiliated candidate Mohammed Morsi narrowly won the presidency in Egypt's first fair and free democratic election. Little did Morsi and his supporters realize the counter-revolution had already begun. such that a year into his admittedly incompetent administration, Egyptian protesters returned to the famed Tahrir Square in Cairo on June 30th, 2013, demanding early presidential elections via the Tamarrud, or the rebel campaign. In the euphoria of those protests, calls for early elections were quickly elided by active and direct intervention by the Egyptian military, such that on July 3rd, under the stewardship of General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the Egyptian democratic experiment was quickly aborted via a military coup and replaced with a return to an authoritarianism not seen in decades. And what proved outright alarming was the involvement of these same liberal figures in what became the counter-revolutionary moment in Egypt, up to and including acquiescence in the face of the infamous massacre of some 1,000 Brotherhood-affiliated protesters in Cairo's Rab al-Adawiyah Square in August of 2013, and the crackdown on Egyptian civil society more broadly ever since. After all, many of these figures had built careers on the premise that while they were no fans of the Muslim Brotherhood as such, that Islamists must be allowed into the political process, be domesticated, lest they get radicalized. Now those same figures are declaring open season on Islamists qua Islamists. Needless to say, this kind of made me scratch my head. Perhaps the most telling moment for me, which motivated me to shift gears in my own scholarly work and return more formatively to Egypt, was an interview in the Egyptian daily Al-Masri Yom, in which an old mentor was quoted as saying, quote, انتخابات رئاسة 2014 الأفضل في تاريخ مصر. The election results of 2014 were the greatest in the history of Egypt. That raised my eyebrows sufficiently to more fully return to debates I'd otherwise left behind several years prior to, and at that point I engaged my collaborative partner, Dr. Dalia Fehmi, who is an Egypt specialist. From there, what became an anecdotal observation, which is that a key contingent of contemporary Egyptian liberals in the revolutionary upheaval between 2011 and 2013 ultimately adopted outright illiberal proclivities to support and give rise to the counter-revolution, in turn gave rise to a bona fide scholarly thesis and intervention. And that came full circle by critically investigating the historical genealogies of liberalism in Egypt. This begins in the late 19th and early 20th century, in a period referred to in Western historiography as the Liberal Age, to quote the intellectual historian Albert Harani. Situated in a broader context of the Arab Renaissance, or the Nahda, a movement spearheaded largely as a reaction to European material ascendancy over Arab lands by the 19th century, figures associated with the Liberal Age began as inheritors of a particular trend within the Nahda typically referred to as Islamic modernism, under the leadership of figures like Jamal Din al-Afghani, Mohammed Abdo, and later Rashid Rida. This strand of the Nahda attempted to challenge Eurocentric posturing towards the East by reasserting Islamic thought's fundamental capacity or compatibility with rationalism as a basis of modernist reform. Incidentally, this trend of Islamic modernism ultimately gave rise to Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, who was deeply influenced by the writings of both Abdo and Rida. But that same inheritance of Islamic modernism also gave rise to the persuasion of Arab liberalism that is the focus of this study, an intellectual project that adopted the modernizing agenda of Abdo and his fellow religious reformers, but denuded it of religious predilections. As such, figures like Taha Hussein, Salama Musa, Muhammad Hussein Haykal, and perhaps most famously, Ahmed Lutfi Asayed, the Ustad al-Jil, the teacher of the generation, articulated a political project that was for all intents and purposes molded in the crucible of Europe. Which is to say, many of them had studied at length in Europe and were influenced by European liberal philosophy on the one hand, and by European writers on race and Orientalism on the other hand, which led to the cultivation of a political project that, while territorially Egyptian, was distinctly European in character. In its most obstinate form, strands of early Egyptian liberalism went as far as actively renounce Egypt's allegedly false association with Arabic and Islamic identity by instead adopting the language of Egypt's pharaonic past as a means of securing Egypt's proper place as part of the West, per ancient Egypt's connections with the Hellenic world. Regrettably for the Liberal Age, though, this European and militantly secular mold of citizenship made little sense for the majority of Egyptians for whom religious metaphysics remained a guiding force of daily life. As a caveat, I should point out here this is not some uninterrupted or neatly packaged linear trajectory, that several figures associated with Egyptian liberalism, like the feminist Huda Sha'arawi, the nationalist leader Saad Zaghlul, and many others, offered at least perfunctory reference to the Arab and Islamic intellectual and cultural heritage, or the Turath. But the fact remains that even with these exceptions, Egyptian liberalism of the variety discussed here grounded itself on a distinctly European and obstinately secular model of liberal subjectivity and citizenship, a model that was simply not congruent with the condition of everyday Egyptian society at the time. Accordingly, seeing the Egyptian masses as too backward and irrational to fit the proper mold of citizenship in the first place, early liberals unambiguously embraced statism, seeking active state intervention to properly cultivate the appropriate preconditions of liberal citizenship, including arenas of public life, particularly concerning religious devotional practices, that bear no discernible relevance to citizenship as such. And therein lies the contradiction, ladies and gentlemen. Despite adopting a philosophical worldview of liberalism that is allegedly predicated on the sanctity of individual autonomy and a constraint on sovereign power, Egyptian liberalism has from its inception been a project wedded to a deeply powerful central state. This statist proclivity comes full circle in the late 1940s, as the liberals grew increasingly disillusioned with the existing political structure's capacity to implement reforms. Following the election of the Liberal Left Party in January 1950, and its subsequent refusal to implement meaningful parliamentary reform, culminating in the 1952 burning of Cairo, the dismissal of the Weft, and the return of martial law, key liberal figures ultimately gave up on pursuing their project through traditional political channels. Rather, that same contingent of Egyptian liberals began to actively endorse the rise of a left-wing reformist dictatorship, as they put it, al-mustabid al-adil, the just tyrant, to emerge and to forcibly create the conditions of liberal citizenship and civil society, single-handedly inaugurate the modernist reforms they sought, and then benevolently step aside, such that Ihsan Abdel-Qaddus, then the editor-in-chief of the prominent liberal magazine Ruz al-Yusuf, could write in February 1952 that, quote, Egypt is in temporary need of a dictator, one who will act, quote, for the people, not against them, for, not against freedom, a dictator who will push Egypt forward and not hold her back. And in the Free Officers Movement and the rise of President Gamal Abdel Nasser, the liberals got their just tyrant, who proved anything but temporary, as Nasser's authoritarian rule produced precisely the police state that continues to govern Egypt to this day. This is, of course, all a redaction, but I submit that the liberal proclivities of the Egyptian liberal activists post-2013, particularly their antagonism towards the Muslim Brotherhood, owe much to the equally contradictory inheritances from their ancestors in the early and mid-20th century. And perhaps most surprisingly of all, this statist posturing by Egyptian liberals ultimately makes them bedfellows with their avowed arch nemesis. Despite liberalism as a project in Egypt presenting itself as a bulwark against and diametrical opposition to the forces of Islamism in general and the Muslim Brotherhood in particular, I argue that the two movements are ultimately philosophically tied at the hip on this fundamental basis, and that both are deeply wedded to ideological statism. Here I offer a more detailed reading of the genealogies of liberalism, which I've done my best to succinctly outline for the purposes of this presentation, and juxtapose it with a very close reading of the political philosophy of the Muslim Brotherhood, namely key treatises by its founder Hassan al-Banna and its key intellectual architect Said Qutb. In so doing, I uncover that, like Egyptian liberalism, the Muslim Brotherhood project is one equally beset by contradictions. Its founder, Hassan al-Banna, in the mold of earlier Islamic reformist thinkers like Muhammad Abdul Jamaluddin al-Afghani and others, attempted to model an Islamic reform project that was congruent with the demands of popular sovereignty characteristic of constitutionalism and the modern nation state. And in that process, al-Banna assigns a considerable role to the state in securing the discursive and non-discursive conditions that would allow for a modern Islamic society to come to fruition. Like his liberal adversaries, al-Banna ultimately offers a project of reform that requires the guiding hand of an all-powerful central state to forcibly create the conditions for a proper Islamic society. A radical departure, it's worth noting, to the largely decentralized model of governance typified in the medieval Islamic framework on which he is allegedly drawing. And as the Brotherhood project develops, this proclivity produces a tension with the work of Said Qutb, who, in contradistinction to his predecessor in his desire to reconcile Islam with modernity through the hand of an increasingly powerful state apparatus, ultimately grew disenchanted with modernity, a reflection of a malaise toward modern forms of metaphysics undergirding the modern nation state that permeated the 1950s and 60s in the aftermath of World War II. In Qutb's case, that disillusionment was forged through his antagonistic relationship with the modernist authoritarianism of Nasser, who eventually executed him in 1966. Qutb thus instead offers a radical critique of modernity modeled on Islamic auspices. This ultimately produced a historical tension between al-Banna's project, or attempt to harmonize Islam with modernity via a powerful central state on the one hand, and Qutb's radical critique of modernity on the other hand. And regrettably, I argue the Brotherhood failed to properly build on either al-Banna's project or Qutb's project with any serious intellectual rigor. The end result, I argue, necessarily pushed the Brotherhood project to an authoritarian form of modernism, one predicated on al-Banna's statist proclivity to inaugurate a modern Islamic society, but simultaneously weighted down by the rejection of contaminating modern values as articulated by Qutb. Thus, to protect against those contaminating influences, the all-encompassing modern Islamic state, as articulated by al-Banna, necessarily takes on an authoritarian character, a phenomenon that comes full circle in the Brotherhood's short-lived rule of Egypt under Mohammed Morsi. Ultimately then, Egyptian liberals share far more in common with their avowed arch-nemesis in the Muslim Brotherhood than they are willing to admit. And to bring this full circle, offering this juxtaposition allows us to see more clearly that just like the Brotherhood, in light of its most recent failures, needs to fundamentally revisit the origins of its political project and its ultimate aims, so does the project of liberalism in Egypt. Indeed, in recent years, liberal theory has been forced to more seriously reconsider the issue of religious metaphysics, now recognizing that such comprehensive doctrines, to use John Rawls's expression, do not necessarily neatly fit within the fetters of public reasonable discourse as such that liberal scions like Jürgen Habermas have increasingly turned to the question of liberal rationalism and the question of religion. In this same vein, Egyptian liberals, if they expect their project to have any long-term viability, need to similarly wrestle with the new challenges to liberal theory and the presuppositions undergirding liberal rationalism as they have originally conceived it. And saving liberalism in Egypt will ultimately require that Egyptian liberals find a proper basis for contextualizing liberal rationalism beyond its classical Protestant origins in Europe in a way that does justice to the imminent social and cultural realities of Egypt. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I'll end by offering a brief reading by the end from the end of my first chapter. Is the experience of Europe in 1848 an ominous sign of things to come in Egypt? Should the capitulation by Egyptian liberals in the aftermath of the events of July 3rd, 2013 be read as indicative of an abandonment by Egyptian liberalism of its revolutionary ambitions and its domestication into the ideology of the bourgeois Egyptian gentleman? Not necessarily. Indeed, the European experience is one of a vacillation between revolution and counter-revolution, in which the immediate aftermath of mass revolts said very little about the legacies those upheavals would ultimately leave behind. While the security state under Sisi may appear to have the upper hand in Egypt as of this writing, the story of the Egyptian Revolution of 2011 remains a work in progress, irrespective of the ground lost to the ideals of that initial uprising since the return of military rule in 2013. Dissensions in Egyptian society run as deep now as, if not deeper than, before the events of 2011, as evidenced perhaps most recently by mass protests throughout the nation following the Sisi administration's decision to grant territorial control of Tiran and Samafir, strategically important islands off Egypt's Red Sea coast, to Saudi Arabia in April of 2016. Remaining faithful to a longue durée approach to history, in which long-term historical structures play a more palpable role in the ebb and flow of history than individual events themselves, we can and should view the Egyptian Revolution as an unfinished project that can just as easily culminate in the fulfillment of the ideals of freedom and dignity that sparked the initial protests in January of 2011 as to their abandonment. Similarly, the story of liberalism in Egypt remains an unfinished project, one that can just as conceivably be elevated into an emancipatory political force as it could be domesticated into a desiccated relic of Egyptian elites, which is to say the contradictions of liberalism in Egypt are not necessarily binding, and with sufficient wherewithal from those who carry its banner, the liberal project in Egypt can indeed be reconstituted to overcome its present impasse. Whether that will in fact transpire remains to be seen. But as we shall demonstrate in the pages that follow, taking ample stock, Discerning the ultimate fate of Egyptian liberalism requires taking ample stock in the specific contours of the liberal project in its Egyptian context, historically, institutionally, and culturally. And in so doing, we can credibly end by saying that the fate of the liberal experiment in Egypt will wholly depend on the extent to which Egyptian liberals are willing to articulate their political project in a way that does sufficient justice to the imminent social and cultural realities of Egyptian culture and society. If Egypt and the Contradictions of Liberalism is to offer only one formative lasting critique, it is that the contradictions of the liberal experiment in Egypt can only be overcome by realigning the project to speak to the needs of the Egyptian people in a cultural, social, and yes, religious idiom that they find congruent. And with that, I'll end here. Thank you very much.
A lot packed in, but.
Yeah, try
Floor
to-
is open.
Can we pass this around?
By all means.
So before we plunge into the philosophical discussion, could you say just a few words about the practical production level of this exercise and what you yourself have learned out of all the contributions
Okay,
that you
well.
didn't know going into the project?
Sure. If I
Sure.
could-
I mean,
on my
is
person-
this something that, for instance, your chapter that you wrote, is it rising on the shoulder, stepping on